My name is Abigail, and at 34 years old, I stood at my cousin Emma's engagement party, wearing a simple black dress while her future in-laws laughed at my little office job. They had no idea that the company they spent all evening bragging about now belonged to me. Before I share what happened that changed everything, tell me where you're watching from. If you've ever been underestimated, please like and subscribe, because this story will show you how silence can be the most powerful response. Growing up in Seattle, I learned early that appearances could be deceiving. My parents divorced when I was 12 years old, and while my father moved to California with his new family, I stayed with my mother, Margaret, who worked double shifts as a nurse at Swedish Medical Center. We lived in a modest two-bedroom apartment in Ballard, where the sound of rain on the roof became my nightly lullaby. Money was always tight, but my mother made sure I understood that education was the one investment that would never depreciate. I threw myself into my studies with the kind of determination that only comes from watching your single mother count pennies at the grocery store. Every A on my report card felt like a small victory against circumstances that seemed determined to limit my future. When I was 17, I received a full scholarship to Stanford University. The day that acceptance letter arrived, my mother cried for the first time since the divorce. But these were tears of joy. At Stanford, I majored in computer science with a minor in business administration. While my classmates spent weekends at parties in Palo Alto, I spent mine coding in the library and attending entrepreneurship workshops. I graduated summa cum laude at 22 and immediately enrolled in Stanford's MBA program, completing it at 26. But degrees were just paper. What mattered was what I did with them. The idea for Nexus Solutions came to me during my final year of business school. I noticed how many mid-sized companies struggled with digital transformation, lacking either the resources for major consultants or the expertise to handle it internally. I started the company from my studio apartment in Redwood City, working 18-hour days living on instant ramen and determination. The first year was brutal. I had 3 clients, no employees, and barely enough revenue to cover my rent. But I persisted. By year 2, I had hired my first employee, a brilliant developer named Marcus, who believed in my vision. By year 3, we had an office, 15 employees, and contracts worth $2 million. By year 8, Nexus Solutions had become a $5 billion technology consulting firm, with offices in 12 cities and over 3,000 employees. Yet despite this success, I maintained a low profile. No magazine covers, no television interviews, no social media presence beyond a basic LinkedIn profile. I learned that real power doesn't need announcement. My cousin Emma was 5 years younger than me, raised by my Aunt Catherine and Uncle Douglas in Bellevue's wealthy suburbs. Where I had learned frugality, Emma had learned frivolity. Where I had developed resilience, Emma had developed a sense of entitlement. Her Instagram feed was a carefully curated collection of designer handbags, exotic vacations funded by her parents, and selfies with Seattle's social elite. She worked as an event coordinator for a high-end wedding planning firm, a job she got through her mother's connections rather than her own merit. When Emma announced her engagement to Christopher Sterling, she made sure everyone knew he was a vice president at Sterling Industries, one of Seattle's established corporations. She posted about it 17 times in the first week alone, each post emphasizing his title, his family's wealth, and their combined social status. The engagement ring, a 3-carat diamond surrounded by sapphires, appeared in every photo from multiple angles. The invitation to the engagement party arrived at my office on a Tuesday afternoon. Printed on pearl white cardstock with gold embossing, it announced a celebration at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel's Spanish Ballroom. 250 guests were invited to celebrate what Emma called the merger of 2 of Seattle's finest families. I almost declined, but my mother, ever the peacemaker, called and asked me to attend. Family is family, she said, even when they forget what that means. The night of the party, I had just finished a critical board meeting where we finalized the acquisition of Sterling Industries. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 6 months, my team had orchestrated a hostile takeover of the company, where Christopher worked, where his father Harold served as senior vice president, where his mother Patricia held a suspicious consulting contract, and where his sister Madison directed marketing efforts that were mediocre at best. The acquisition papers were signed, sealed, and would be announced Monday morning. but that night, none of them knew their professional world had already changed. I arrived at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel 45 minutes late, wearing a simple black sheath dress from Zara that cost $49 and comfortable flats that had seen better days. My hair was pulled back in a basic ponytail, and my only jewelry was the small silver watch my mother had given me for graduation. The valet at the entrance looked at my 5-year-old Honda Civic with barely concealed disdain before reluctantly taking my keys. The Spanish ballroom was transformed into what Emma probably thought was elegant, but looked more like a golden fever dream. Crystal chandeliers reflected off gold-draped tables, white roses competed with white orchids for attention, and a string quartet played classical music that nobody was actually listening to. Guests milled about in designer gowns and custom suits air-kissing, and exchanging business cards with practiced insincerity. Emma spotted me from across the room and waved me over with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for showing off a pet at a party. She wore a rose gold sequined dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and her professionally styled hair cascaded in perfect waves that would last exactly as long as the party. She kissed my cheek with lips sticky from too much gloss and immediately turned to a group of women beside her. These must be Christopher's relatives, I thought, noting their similar expressions of polite disdain mixed with curiosity. Emma grabbed my arm with manicured nails and announced to the group that I was her cousin, who worked in some office doing something with computers. The dismissive way she said it made it clear that my presence was obligatory, not desired. The first person Emma introduced me to was Harold Sterling Christopher's father, a man whose handshake was deliberately crushing, and whose smile never reached his eyes. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with silver hair styled to perfection, and a Tom Ford suit that he made sure everyone noticed by adjusting his cuffs every 30 seconds. Beside him stood Patricia, his wife, wearing a burgundy Oscar de la Renta dress and enough diamonds to fund a small startup. Her Botox-frozen face attempted what might have been a smile, but looked more like mild constipation. Patricia looked me up and down with the kind of assessment usually reserved for checking produce at the grocery store. Her gaze lingered on my simple dress, my unadorned ears, my practical shoes. When she finally met my eyes, her expression had settled into poorly disguised pity, mixed with superiority. She extended her hand, like she was doing me a favor, her grip limp and brief, as if poverty might be contagious. Madison Sterling. Christopher's younger sister stood slightly apart, scrolling through her phone with the intensity of someone trying to look important. At 28, she had that peculiar combination of privilege and insecurity that manifests as constant need for validation. Her Valentino dress was stunning, but didn't quite fit right, and her Jimmy Choo heels were clearly causing her pain, though she'd never admit it. She looked up from her phone long enough to give me a once-over, and immediately dismissed me as unworthy of her full attention. Emma began the introductions with excessive enthusiasm as if presenting a circus act. She explained that I worked in tech, saying the words the way someone might say, "I clean toilets for a living." Harold's reaction was immediate and predictable. He chuckled, the sound rich with condescension, and asked if I was another one of those startup dreamers thinking they'd change the world with an app. Before I could respond, he launched into what was clearly a well-rehearsed speech about real business versus playing entrepreneur. He explained as if I were a child that established corporations like Sterling Industries were where actual business happened. Startups, he said, were just gambling with other people's money, hoping to get bought out by real companies. The irony of his words, given that I had just bought his real company with my startup money, was delicious. Patricia chimed in, asking what exactly I did in tech. When I simply said I worked in consulting, she laughed a tinkling sound that managed to be both melodious and cruel. She said her nephew also worked in consulting, which was just a fancy word for being unemployed with a business card. Madison looked up from her phone long enough to add that everyone in Seattle claimed to work in tech these days, as if knowing how to use Instagram made them the next Bill Gates. Christopher appeared then, sliding an arm around Emma's waist with practiced charm. He was handsome in that generic way that photographs well but leaves no lasting impression, with sandy brown hair, blue eyes, and a chin that tried too hard to be strong. His Brooks Brothers suit was expensive, but safe, the uniform of someone who wanted to be taken seriously but lacked the imagination to stand out. He shook my hand with politician-like enthusiasm, all teeth and no sincerity. Emma immediately began telling him about my little job in tech, emphasizing little in a way that made it clear she found my career choice quaint, but ultimately pointless. Christopher nodded along, offering what he probably thought was encouragement, by saying that tech was interesting, but volatile. He preferred the stability of established industries, he said, where you could build a real career instead of chasing unicorns. The conversation turned to Sterling Industries, and Harold couldn't resist the opportunity to boast. He spoke about the company's 70-year history, its 16,000 employees, its market dominance in aerospace manufacturing. He mentioned deals worth hundreds of millions, partnerships with defense contractors, expansion plans into Asian markets. Every achievement was peppered with "I arranged" or "my team delivered," though I knew from my due diligence that Harold's actual contribution to the company's success was minimal at best. Madison finally put down her phone to join the conversation, eager to share her own importance. She talked about the new marketing campaign she was spearheading, a digital transformation initiative that would revolutionize how Sterling Industries engaged with customers. She used buzzwords like synergy and paradigm shift with the confidence of someone who had memorized a TED Talk without understanding it. The campaign she described was actually created by my team at Nexus Solutions, delivered as part of a consulting contract 3 months ago. But she'd never know that. When they asked about my career progression, their questions dripped with false concern. Patricia wondered if I had considered getting a real job with benefits and stability. Madison suggested that Sterling Industries might have entry-level positions in their IT department if I wanted to learn how big companies actually operated. Harold offered to put in a word with HR, though he made it clear this would be a huge favor, and I should be grateful for the opportunity. Emma laughed at each of their comments, adding her own observations about how I had always been too focused on work instead of finding a husband. At my age, she said I should be thinking about settling down instead of playing career woman. She gestured at Christopher as if he were a prize at the state fair, talking about how security came from marrying well, not from chasing impossible dreams in a garage somewhere. The contempt in their voices was breathtaking. They spoke to me the way people speak to children, or the mentally impaired slowly and loudly as if I might not understand their sophisticated world. Every sentence was a small dagger wrapped in silk, designed to wound while maintaining plausible deniability. If I complained, I would be too sensitive. If I defended myself, I would be desperate. So I smiled and nodded, letting them feel superior, while knowing their world would crumble in less than 72 hours. As dinner was announced, we moved to our assigned table, where the humiliation continued with renewed vigor. The seating arrangement was clearly deliberate. Emma and Christopher sat at the center, flanked by his parents, while I was placed at the far end between Madison and Christopher's ancient great-aunt Dolores, who spent the entire meal complaining about her digestive issues. The place cards were gold-embossed, everyone's except mine, which was clearly a last-minute addition written in hurried pen. The first course arrived, some kind of deconstructed Caesar salad that looked like someone had sneezed lettuce onto a plate. Harold used this opportunity to continue his business lecture, explaining to the table how he had just closed a $40 million deal with Boeing. He described the negotiation process in exhaustive detail, portraying himself as a master strategist who had outmaneuvered everyone. I happened to know the deal had been in progress for 2 years and was actually closed by Sterling's legal team, while Harold was on vacation in Cabo, but I kept that information to myself. Patricia turned the conversation to fashion, commenting on everyone's attire, with backhanded compliments that were actually insults. She praised Emma's dress while mentioning it was brave to wear such a bold color with her skin tone. She complimented Madison's shoes while noting they were from last season. When she got to me, she paused, dramatically tilted her head, and said my dress was practical, which was probably smart given my situation. The word situation hung in the air like a bad smell. Madison, emboldened by her mother's cruelty, decided to share her thoughts on success and ambition. She explained that some people were meant to be leaders, while others were meant to be followers, and there was no shame in accepting your place in the hierarchy. She looked directly at me while saying this, her meaning crystal clear. She talked about her MBA from the University of Washington as if it were a Nobel Prize, though I knew from LinkedIn that she had graduated with a 2.8 GPA. The main course arrived some overcooked salmon with asparagus that had seen better days. Christopher decided this was the perfect time to discuss his upcoming promotion to senior vice president, a position that would make him one of the youngest senior executives in Sterling's history. He spoke about his 5-year plan, his vision for the company, his strategies for growth. Every sentence started with I or my, as if Sterling Industries was his personal empire, rather than a struggling corporation bleeding money from poor management and outdated practices. Emma hung on his every word, occasionally interjecting to remind everyone that she would be married to a senior vice president. She had already started planning how she would redecorate the executive spouse lounge, what charities she would chair, which country club memberships they would pursue. She spoke about their future children attending Lakeside School, about summers in the San Juan Islands, about the house they would build in Medina near Bill Gates. Her entire identity had become Mrs. Future Christopher Sterling. The conversation turned to my personal life with Patricia, asking if I was seeing anyone special. When I said I was focused on my career, she exchanged knowing looks with Madison and Emma. Patricia said it was such a shame when women prioritized work over family, as if the feminist movement had confused everyone about what really mattered. She spoke about the fulfillment of marriage, the joy of supporting a successful husband, the importance of knowing your role. Every word was aimed at me like a carefully targeted missile. Madison added that she had managed to balance both career and relationships, though everyone knew her boyfriend was a trust fund baby who spent his days playing golf and posting gym selfies. She gave advice about making time for what mattered, about not being so aggressive that you scared men away, about the importance of being feminine despite working. Her condescension was so thick you could spread it on toast. Then came the wine incident. Patricia stood to make a toast to the happy couple, her glass of Cabernet Sauvignon held high. As she walked past my chair, her heel supposedly caught on the carpet, and the entire glass of red wine poured down the front of my black dress. The gasp from the table was theatrical, but I caught the slight smirk on Patricia's face before she transformed it into exaggerated concern. She grabbed napkins and started dabbing at my dress, making it worse, while apologizing profusely. Between apologies, she managed to mention that at least the dress was black, so the stain wouldn't show too much, and it was a good thing it wasn't expensive, or she would feel terrible. Emma laughed and said I was used to spills and stains from eating at my desk all the time, turning my humiliation into a punchline. The entire table laughed, that kind of uncomfortable laughter that comes from witnessing cruelty, but being too polite to object. I excused myself to the bathroom to clean up passing mirrors that reflected a woman covered in wine like a crime scene. In the bathroom, 2 women from the party were gossiping about the poor cousin, who clearly didn't belong at such an elegant event. They didn't know I was in the stall listening to them dissect my appearance, my obvious financial struggles, my desperate attempts to fit in where I clearly didn't belong. They wondered why Emma had even invited me, speculating that it was probably out of pity or family obligation. When I returned to the table, they had moved on to discussing their recent vacations. Harold talked about their month in Switzerland, Patricia about shopping in Paris, Madison, about her Instagram-worthy trip to Dubai. They asked if I had traveled recently, knowing full well what my answer would be. When I mentioned a business trip to New York, Madison laughed and said that didn't count unless you stayed somewhere nicer than a Holiday Inn. The assumption that I stayed in cheap hotels was automatic, though my actual suite at the Plaza had cost $2,000 a night. Christopher's great-aunt Dolores chose this moment to tell me about her nephew, who was also single, and might be interested in meeting me. She described him as stable, which I quickly learned meant unemployed, and distinguished, which meant old. She said he wasn't picky about appearances or financial situations, which was her way of saying he was desperate enough to date beneath his station. The table found this hilarious, with Emma suggesting we could have a double wedding to save money. After dinner, the party moved into cocktail hour while the band set up for dancing. This was when the real performance began. Harold gathered a group of business associates and began holding court, discussing Sterling Industries, as if he were Warren Buffett dispensing wisdom. He talked about market disruption, competitive advantages, strategic positioning, all while having no idea his company had been disrupted, outmaneuvered, and positioned for takeover by the woman he'd been insulting all evening. I stood near the bar nursing a glass of water when Madison approached with her friends, a group of women who all looked like they'd been pressed from the same Instagram influencer mold. They were discussing their careers, each trying to outdo the other with tales of professional triumph. Madison described her marketing genius, how she'd increased engagement by 30%, how she'd revolutionized Sterling's brand identity. Her friends cooed appropriately impressed by numbers they didn't understand, and achievements that weren't real. One of them, a blonde named Brittany, who worked in public relations, asked what I did. Before I could answer, Madison jumped in, explaining that I worked in tech support or something equally mundane. She said it with pity, as if describing someone's terminal illness. Brittany made sympathetic noises and said that at least tech support was stable work, even if it wasn't glamorous. Another friend, Jessica, mentioned that her company outsourced all their tech support to India, wondering aloud if my job was at risk. They began offering career advice, each suggestion more patronizing than the last. I should learn to code, one said, as if that were a revolutionary idea. Another suggested I try to get certifications, maybe work my way up to management someday. Madison graciously offered to look at my resume, though she made it clear she was very busy and important, so this would be a significant favor. They spoke about networking, about the importance of connections, completely oblivious to the fact that my network could buy and sell their entire social circle. Christopher appeared with a group of his Sterling Industries colleagues, all middle management types, who wore their small amount of power like a neon sign. They were discussing the company's future, speculating about expansion bonuses and promotions. Christopher mentioned the acquisition rumors that had been circulating, dismissing them as desperate moves by failing competitors. He assured everyone that Sterling was too strong, too established, to be bought by what he called new money tech trash. One of his colleagues, a man named Brett, who managed accounts payable, made a joke about tech companies being all smoke and mirrors, worthless without actual products or infrastructure. Another, David from Human Resources, added that he'd seen dozens of tech startups fail their employees begging for real jobs at real companies like Sterling. They all laughed, that smug laugh of people who think they're safe in their fortress, while the enemy is already inside the gates. Patricia gathered her society friends, women who lunched professionally, and thought charity galas counted as work. They discussed their various boards and committees, their fundraising goals, their social calendars that were busier than most CEOs. Patricia mentioned that she was considering starting a nonprofit to help underprivileged women enter the workforce, looking directly at me as if I were her target demographic. Her friend Vivian suggested I could be their first success story if I was willing to work hard and follow their guidance. The condescension reached its peak when Harold decided to give a toast to his son's engagement. He stood on the small stage, microphone in hand, and began what turned into a 15-minute speech about legacy, tradition, and the importance of choosing the right partner. He talked about Emma joining a family of achievers, of leaders, of people who understood what real success looked like. He mentioned Sterling Industries 14 times, each reference designed to remind everyone of his importance. He spoke about the future, about the empire Christopher would inherit, about the dynasty they were building. He said Emma was lucky to be marrying into such success, that not everyone had the opportunity to elevate themselves through marriage. The implication was clear, and several people glanced at me with pity, the poor cousin who would never have such an opportunity. Emma beamed beside Christopher, apparently unbothered by the suggestion that her value came from whom she was marrying rather than who she was. During the toast, my phone buzzed with a message from my CFO. The final signatures were complete. Sterling Industries was officially a subsidiary of Nexus Solutions. The announcement would go public Monday morning, but the deal was done. I looked at Harold, still pontificating about his legacy, and felt not triumph, but a kind of sadness. He was proud of something that no longer existed, celebrating a kingdom that had already fallen. Madison grabbed the microphone next, unable to resist the spotlight. She talked about love and destiny, but really just used the opportunity to mention her own achievements again. She described Christopher and Emma as a power couple, the kind of partnership that built empires. She made jokes about Emma finally catching someone worthy of her, as if Christopher were a prize bull at auction. She ended by saying she couldn't wait to have Emma as a sister-in-law, someone who understood that marriage was about strategic alliance as much as love. Emma spoke last, and her speech was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd practiced it in front of a mirror for weeks. She thanked everyone for coming, gushed about Christopher's perfection, and made sure to mention his title at Sterling Industries 4 times. She talked about their future, their plans, their dreams, all of which seemed to revolve around his career and her adjacent glory. She thanked his family for accepting her, for elevating her, for allowing her to join their remarkable legacy. Not once did she mention any of her own accomplishments or aspirations. The speeches ended with thunderous applause, everyone celebrating the union of two people who seemed to value status over substance. The band began playing, and couples moved to the dance floor. I remained at my table watching the spectacle with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a primitive tribe. These people had built their entire identities around a company that was about to be gutted and rebuilt by someone they dismissed as nobody. My phone rang, and I stepped out onto the terrace to take the call. It was my head of human resources confirming the restructuring plans for Sterling Industries. 50% workforce reduction, starting with redundant management positions. Harold's role would be eliminated. Patricia's consulting contract would be terminated. Madison's entire marketing department would be outsourced. Christopher's position would be restructured into something so junior, he'd likely resign. The satisfaction I felt wasn't cruel, just practical. Dead weight needed to be cut for the company to survive. When I returned to the ballroom, the party was reaching its crescendo. The cake had been brought out a 7-tier monstrosity that looked like it could collapse under the weight of its own pretension. Emma and Christopher were preparing for the ceremonial cutting surrounded by photographers they'd hired to document every moment of their special night. Patricia was directing the photographers, making sure they captured the Sterling family from their best angles. Harold approached me at the bar, his confidence bolstered by several glasses of whiskey. He put a patronizing hand on my shoulder and told me not to feel bad about my situation. Success wasn't for everyone, he said, and there was no shame in being ordinary. He offered again to help me get an entry-level position at Sterling, though he warned me that I'd have to work harder than everyone else to prove I belonged. The irony of him offering me a job at the company I now owned was almost too perfect. He began explaining the corporate hierarchy at Sterling, how I would need to start at the bottom and work my way up over many years. He said if I showed dedication and learned from my superiors, I might make middle management by the time I was 50. He talked about the importance of knowing your place, of respecting those above you, of understanding that some people were meant to lead, while others were meant to follow. Every word dug his hole deeper, though he had no idea he was already buried. The MC announced it was time for family members to share their well wishes for the couple. Various relatives stood and offered generic platitudes about love and happiness. When the MC asked if anyone else wanted to speak, I stood. The surprise on Emma's face was evident. She hadn't expected me to participate, probably assumed I'd be too intimidated by the elegant crowd. Patricia whispered something to Harold, likely wondering if they should stop me, worried I might embarrass myself and, by extension, them. I walked to the microphone with a confidence that made several people sit up straighter. My voice was calm and clear as I began. I wanted to congratulate Emma on her engagement, I said, and to thank the Sterling family for their hospitality tonight. I mentioned how interesting it had been to hear about Sterling Industries, about their plans for the future, about the legacy they were building. The room relaxed, thinking this was just another toast, though something in my tone made a few people lean forward. I continued saying that the business world was indeed full of surprises, and that sometimes the most significant changes came from unexpected places. I talked about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances, of recognizing that power and influence didn't always announce themselves with expensive suits and loud voices. Harold was nodding along, completely oblivious to where this was heading. Patricia looked bored, examining her manicure while I spoke. Then I said the words that changed everything. As someone who had spent the evening learning about Sterling Industries, I was particularly interested in their future. After all, as the founder and CEO of Nexus Solutions, which had completed its acquisition of Sterling Industries that very afternoon, I had a vested interest in the company's success. The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Harold's face went through a remarkable transformation. The smug confidence drained away, replaced first by confusion, then disbelief, then growing horror as the implications hit him. His whiskey glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor, with a sound that seemed to echo in the silent ballroom. Patricia's Botox couldn't hide her shock, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Madison frantically grabbed her phone, presumably Googling Nexus Solutions and my name, her face paling as she found the information she'd never bothered to look up before. Christopher stood frozen beside Emma, his promotional dreams evaporating in real time. His colleagues from Sterling Industries were all pulling out their phones, checking emails, looking for information about the acquisition they'd dismissed as impossible just hours earlier. The murmur started small, then grew into a roar as the news spread through the room like wildfire. Everyone was Googling, texting, calling, trying to understand what had just happened. I continued speaking, my voice cutting through the chaos. I assured everyone that Nexus Solutions had great plans for Sterling Industries. We would be modernizing operations, streamlining management, and focusing on innovation rather than tradition. Of course, such changes required difficult decisions. Some positions would be eliminated. Some departments would be restructured. Some long-standing arrangements would be reconsidered. I looked directly at Harold, Patricia, and Madison as I said this, watching comprehension dawn on their faces. Emma found her voice first, shrieking that I was lying, that this was some cruel joke designed to ruin her engagement party. She accused me of being jealous, of making up stories to get attention, of trying to destroy her happiness because I was bitter and alone. Her reaction was so extreme, so desperate, that even some of her friends stepped back. Christopher tried to calm her, but he was clearly in shock himself, his mind probably racing through the implications for his career. Madison's phone confirmed what I'd said. She held it up with a shaking hand, showing her mother the Forbes article about the acquisition, complete with my photograph and a detailed breakdown of the deal. There I was identified as one of the youngest female CEOs to execute a hostile takeover of this magnitude. The article mentioned Nexus Solutions' $5 billion valuation, our client list, that included 60% of the Fortune 500, our reputation for aggressive restructuring of acquired companies. Harold tried to salvage something from the wreckage. He approached me with a suddenly respectful tone, suggesting we discuss this privately. He mentioned his years of experience, his institutional knowledge, his valuable relationships. He practically begged for a meeting, offering insider information, promising cooperation, anything to save his position. The desperation in his voice was painful to hear. This man who'd spent the evening explaining success to me, now groveling for professional survival. Patricia suddenly found me fascinating. She complimented my dress, saying black was so elegant and timeless. She mentioned how she'd always admired women in business, how she'd been considering getting more involved in corporate affairs herself. She suggested we have lunch sometime, woman to woman, to discuss opportunities. The transformation was so transparent, so calculated, that I almost admired the effort. Madison approached with tears in her eyes, apologizing for any misunderstandings. She said she'd always respected tech entrepreneurs, that she'd love to learn from my experience. She mentioned her marketing skills, her dedication, her willingness to adapt. She essentially interviewed for her own job right there at her brother's engagement party, surrounded by the ruins of her family's arrogance. Christopher's colleagues scattered like roaches when the lights come on, each probably wondering if their job would exist come Monday. The ones who'd been laughing about tech companies were now terrified of the tech company that owned them. Brett from Accounts Payable looked physically ill. David from Human Resources was already on LinkedIn, probably updating his resume from the bathroom. Emma turned on me with vicious fury, accusing me of deliberately humiliating her on the most important night of her life. She said I'd always been jealous of her beauty, her social life, her ability to find love. She couldn't understand that none of this had been about her, that she'd simply been collateral damage in her own cruelty. She demanded I leave, though she seemed to forget this wasn't her party to control anymore. I looked at the room full of shocked faces at the Sterling family, whose empire had crumbled in a matter of minutes, at Emma, whose perfect engagement had become a nightmare. I hadn't planned to reveal the acquisition that night, but sitting through hours of condescension, mockery, and deliberate humiliation had changed my mind. They'd needed to learn that the person serving you coffee might own the building, that the woman in the simple dress might sign your paychecks. I told them that success wasn't about the show you put on or the titles you inherited. It was about what you built, when nobody was watching the work you did, when there were no photographers or applause. Real power didn't need to announce itself with designer clothes or rehearsed speeches. Sometimes it wore a $49 dress and smiled while you explained how important you were. Before leaving, I addressed Christopher directly. I told him his position would be eliminated in the restructuring, but we'd offer a severance package if he agreed to leave quietly. The promotion he'd been promised was never happening. The future he'd planned was gone. The legacy he thought he'd inherit had been sold to someone they'd spent the evening mocking. His face was a study in devastation, the golden boy realizing he was just another expendable employee. I wished Emma happiness in her marriage, though I wondered how much happiness she'd find now that Christopher's status had evaporated. Would she still want to marry him without the title, the money, the prestige? Would their love survive when he was just another unemployed middle manager in a city full of them? The questions hung in the air as I walked toward the exit, my footsteps echoing in the silent ballroom. The aftermath of the engagement party spread through Seattle's business community like wildfire. By Monday morning, when the acquisition was officially announced, everyone knew what had happened at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel. The story had become legendary, told and retold with various embellishments, though the truth was dramatic enough without fiction. The Sterling family's public humiliation became a cautionary tale about arrogance and assumptions. Harold's termination was swift and surgical. He was called into a meeting Monday morning expecting to negotiate his survival, only to find his personal belongings already boxed and security ready to escort him out. His 40 years with Sterling Industries ended with a 15-minute meeting and a severance package that was generous only by legal standards. He tried to leverage his relationships, his knowledge, his history with the company. But Nexus Solutions wasn't interested in the past. Patricia's consulting contract, which had paid her $200,000 annually for essentially being Harold's wife, was terminated immediately. The investigation revealed she'd been billing the company for lunches, shopping trips, and spa days, all categorized as business development. The forensic accountants found $2 million in questionable expenses over 5 years. She wasn't prosecuted, but only because the scandal would have damaged the company's reputation during the transition. Madison's entire department was eliminated on Tuesday. The marketing functions were outsourced to a firm in Portland that cost half as much and delivered twice the results. Madison was offered a position as a junior coordinator, essentially an entry-level job, with the understanding that she'd need to prove herself without her father's influence. She declined, too proud to start over, and spent 6 months unemployed before finally taking a position at a startup that paid half her previous salary. Christopher never received his promotion. Instead, he was offered a lateral move to the logistics department in Spokane, a clear demotion disguised as an opportunity. He resigned rather than accept it, telling everyone he was pursuing other opportunities. The wedding was postponed indefinitely, while he searched for a new job, sending out hundreds of resumes that mostly went unanswered. Without the Sterling name and title, he discovered, he was just another middling business major in an oversaturated market. Emma and Christopher's relationship didn't survive the pressure. 6 months after the engagement party, she returned the ring and moved back in with her parents. The wedding that was supposed to be the social event of the season never happened. The deposits were lost, the dress was sold online, and the carefully curated Instagram posts were deleted. Emma eventually apologized to me, though it took her a year to swallow her pride enough to send the email. The email was long and rambling, full of justifications and explanations for her behavior. She said she'd been caught up in Christopher's world, that his family had influenced her, that she hadn't meant to be cruel. But buried in the excuses was genuine remorse. She admitted she'd been embarrassed by my success, threatened by my independence, jealous of my achievements. She tried to make herself feel bigger by making me feel smaller, a strategy that had spectacularly backfired. We met for coffee 18 months after the engagement party. Emma looked different, humbler somehow, wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of designer everything. She talked about starting over, about learning who she was, without someone else's status to define her. She'd gone back to school studying interior design, something she'd always loved but never pursued because it wasn't prestigious enough. She was dating a teacher, someone who didn't care about her family connections or social standing. During our conversation, Emma asked if I'd planned the revelation at her party all along. I told her the truth, that I'd intended to keep quiet to let the news come out through proper channels. But sitting there being treated like I was nothing, listening to them mock everything I'd built while celebrating themselves, I decided they needed to know who they were really talking to. The lesson hadn't been meant for her, but she'd learned it anyway. Madison reached out 6 months later, asking for advice about starting her own marketing consultancy. The humility in her message was striking, so different from the arrogant woman at the party. She'd learned that talent without connections only got you so far, that the real world didn't care about your MBA if you couldn't deliver results. I gave her some guidance, connected her with a few potential clients, though I made it clear this was a professional courtesy, not friendship. Harold never recovered professionally. At 62, he was too old to start over, but too young to retire comfortably. He tried consulting, but his reputation as someone who'd been blindsided by his own company's acquisition preceded him. He eventually took a position as a senior advisor at a small manufacturing firm in Tacoma, a massive step down from his executive suite at Sterling Industries. I heard he'd stopped mentioning his former title at social gatherings. Patricia attempted to reinvent herself as a life coach, creating an Instagram account about resilience and comeback stories. The irony of someone who'd never worked a day in her life giving career advice wasn't lost on anyone. She had 4 clients before the business quietly folded. She now volunteers at a charity thrift store, though I doubt she appreciates the irony of selling the kind of clothes she once mocked. Christopher found work eventually as a mid-level analyst at a small firm in Portland. He married someone else 2 years later, a quiet ceremony with 50 guests instead of the 500-person spectacle he'd planned with Emma. His LinkedIn profile no longer mentions Sterling Industries prominently, and he stopped introducing himself with his title. I occasionally see him at industry conferences where he carefully avoids making eye contact. A year after the acquisition, Sterling Industries posted its highest profits in a decade. The restructuring, though painful, had eliminated the bloat and nepotism that had been slowly killing the company. The employees who remained were grateful for their jobs and motivated to prove themselves. The culture changed from one of entitlement to one of innovation. The company Harold had used as a monument to his ego became a lean, efficient operation that actually served its customers. I never publicized what happened at the engagement party, though the story spread anyway. It became a Silicon Valley legend told at conferences and cocktail parties as an example of why you should never underestimate anyone. Young entrepreneurs approached me at events saying the story inspired them to keep going when faced with dismissal and condescension. Women in tech especially connected with it, understanding the exhaustion of constantly proving yourself to people who'd already decided you didn't matter. My mother heard the story from a colleague and called me concerned. I'd been too harsh. I explained that I hadn't sought revenge, hadn't planned to humiliate anyone. I'd simply stopped pretending to be less than I was to make others comfortable. The Sterling family had built their entire identity on a foundation of superiority that crumbled the moment someone they dismissed as nobody turned out to be somebody. Their fall wasn't my fault. I'd just been there when gravity finally worked. 5 years have passed since that engagement party, and the lessons from that night still resonate. I've built Nexus Solutions into an $8 billion company with offices worldwide. We've acquired 12 more companies, though none of those acquisitions involved personal drama. I've learned to separate business from emotion, though I've never forgotten the importance of respect and humility in all interactions. Emma and I have developed an unexpected friendship. She's successful in her interior design business with clients who value her talent rather than her connections. She married the teacher, a kind man named Thomas, who treats her as an equal rather than a trophy. They have a daughter now, and Emma is determined to raise her with values that prioritize character over status. She often jokes that the worst night of her life led to the best things that ever happened to her. During a recent family dinner, Emma told her daughter the story of the engagement party age-appropriately edited. She explained how she'd learned that treating people based on their appearance or perceived status was not only wrong, but dangerous. You never know who someone really is, she said, what they've accomplished, what they're capable of. The janitor might be studying for a PhD. The barista might be building a business empire. The woman in the simple dress might own everything you hold dear. I've never forgotten the feeling of standing in that ballroom wine-stained and mocked, while people who knew nothing about me explained my own life to me. It's influenced how I run my company, ensuring that every employee from the newest intern to senior management is treated with respect. We have a culture where ideas matter more than titles, where contribution trumps connection, where the quiet voices are given as much attention as the loud ones. The Sterling acquisition became a Harvard Business School case study. though they focused on the hostile takeover tactics rather than the personal drama. Students analyze the financial strategies, the market positioning, the restructuring plans. What they don't study is the human element, the danger of arrogance, the cost of cruelty. Those lessons aren't taught in business school, but they're perhaps the most important ones to learn. I still wear simple clothes, drive a modest car, and avoid the trappings of wealth that seem to consume so many successful people. Not because I can't afford better, but because I've learned that true power doesn't need decoration. The ability to change lives, to build something from nothing, to transform industries, that's what matters. The rest is just costume jewelry on an empire of substance. Sometimes I think about Harold, Patricia, Madison, and Christopher, and I feel a strange mix of pity and gratitude. Pity because they lost everything they'd built their identities around. Gratitude because they taught me that respect is reciprocal, that kindness costs nothing, that you should never mistake quiet for weak or simple for stupid. They gave me the gift of showing them exactly who I was at the moment they were certain I was nobody. The business world is full of people like the Sterlings, those who inherit their positions and mistake privilege for accomplishment. They build their towers on foundations of assumption, never checking if the ground beneath them is solid. They treat service workers, assistants, and anyone they perceive as beneath them with casual cruelty, never considering that today's nobody might be tomorrow's somebody, or that somebody might already be there, just choosing not to announce it. The most successful people I know, the ones who build lasting empires rather than temporary kingdoms, understand that every interaction matters. They treat the receptionist with the same respect as the CEO, not because they might need something from them, but because it's the right way to be. They understand that power is temporary, that industries change, that the only thing you truly own is your character. As I write this, sitting in my office that overlooks Elliott Bay, I can see the Fairmont Olympic Hotel in the distance. Sometimes I think about that night, about the moment when everything shifted, when the mockery turned to silence, when the powerful became powerless. It wasn't revenge that motivated me to speak up. It was exhaustion. Exhaustion from smiling while being insulted, from pretending to be less than I was, from allowing people to feel superior at my expense. That night taught me that silence in the face of disrespect isn't politeness, it's permission. By not correcting their assumptions, I'd allowed them to build a false narrative that made them comfortable. The revelation of my identity wasn't cruel. It was simply true. The fact that the truth destroyed their world says more about the fragility of their construction than the power of my words. I learned that the loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful. Real power whispers. It works quietly, efficiently, without need for recognition or applause. It builds while others boast plans, while others party executes, while others explain. The Sterling family spent so much time talking about their importance that they never noticed the ground shifting beneath their feet, never saw the acquisition coming until it was already complete. The final lesson from that night is perhaps the most important. Success isn't about reaching a point where you can look down on others. It's about reaching a point where you no longer need to look down on anyone. True achievement comes with the understanding that everyone has value, that everyone deserves respect, that the person you mock today might be the person you beg tomorrow. The universe has a sense of humor about hubris, and karma keeps impeccable books. The engagement party at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel has become more than just a story about business and revenge. It's become a reminder that we never really know who we're talking to, what battles they've fought, what empires they've built in silence. The woman in the simple dress might be a billionaire. The man serving your coffee might be a genius. The person you're explaining success to might have already achieved more than you can imagine. So the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on their appearance, their perceived status, or your assumptions about their life, remember that night at the Fairmont. Remember Harold's face when he realized the nobody he'd been condescending to owned his company. Remember Patricia's desperate attempts to befriend someone she'd spent hours insulting. Remember Madison's tears as her carefully constructed identity crumbled. Remember Christopher's dreams evaporating in real time. And remember that sometimes the most powerful response to mockery isn't anger or argument. Sometimes it's simply revealing the truth and letting the silence that follows say everything that needs to be said. Because silence, when it comes after revelation, hits harder than any words ever could. I often wonder what would have happened if they'd been kind that night, if they'd welcomed me, genuinely asked about my work with real interest, treated me as an equal rather than a charity case. The acquisition would have still happened, the restructuring would have still occurred. But perhaps Harold could have kept an advisory role. Perhaps Madison's department could have been reformed rather than eliminated. Perhaps relationships could have been salvaged. Kindness costs nothing but can save everything. How do you treat people when you think they have nothing to offer you? How do you act when you believe you're speaking to someone beneath your station? Your answer to these questions reveals more about your character than any resume title or bank account ever could. Because in the end, we're all just humans trying to make our way in the world. And the person you step on today might be the one you need tomorrow. Thank you for listening to my story. Have you ever been underestimated or dismissed because of how you looked or what people assumed about you? Share your experience in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to hear more real-life tales of triumph over adversity. Share this with someone who needs to hear that their current circumstances don't define their future potential. Remember, your worth isn't determined by other people's inability to see your value. Until next time, keep building your empire, even if you're doing it in silence.